Whichever media you watch or listen to these days, if they're not telling you about the big picture and what's going on the ground in the country that has made itself the sworn enemy of the United States and is trying to take over the American way of life without firing a single shot, you are missing vital information that kind of ties together everything that's going on in society around us today here in the US. And I'm not just talking about America. This affects everyone in the world, no matter where you are. But Americans, you got to be paying attention to this. And most corporate media, if not all, in the US have financial ties to the Chinese Communist Party. So they're not going to give you the whole picture. You might see a little bit of, protests here and there, a headline here and there, but we need to be getting regular information on this. And that's why I'm so happy to be interviewing Joshua Philipp, senior investigative journalist for the Epoch Times. They have had their finger on the pulse of China for decades. We're talking about his new documentary, The Final War, which, yes, is all about the CCP and the US, but we're going to land on some hope. I guarantee you that. Is the CCP, beyond being the world's worst human rights abuser, world's largest totalitarian regime, biggest mass murderer, is it also a paper tiger? To find out, you do not want to miss this interview with Joshua Philipp. I am Kay Rubicek, and you are watching the Today with Kay show. There's a saying, don't wait to buy gold and wait. That saying is more true now than ever. Just a month ago, gold was at a multi-year low, but now it is up more than 10%, and gold isn't the only precious metal you can use to secure your assets. Just a few months ago, silver was also at a multi-year low, but it is now up more than 30%. So don't wait to buy gold and wait. Talk to someone you can trust. Go to ourgoldguy.com to schedule your free consultation with Our Gold Guy, Ira. That's ourgoldguy.com. Joshua, thank you so much for being with me here today. China is just such a hot topic, but a lot of people say to me, we have so many problems in the US. Like, really, look all around. There's a lot of problems. Why should we be looking at China? What's your answer to
Okay,
that?
well, always a pleasure being here with you. Did your old show before on Epic TV and had you on my show Crossroads. It's always a pleasure. Um, I've been asked that question. Funny enough, it's like why do you criticize the CCP when there are abuses right here at home? Why do you talk about human rights in China when Obama and all this other stuff? Well, what they've done things too. If you talk about, for example, the persecution of Falun Gong with Chinese people, one thing they come back and say, oh, or the Muslim Uyghurs. Well, didn't Obama do the war in Iraq? Or sorry, didn't Bush do the war in Iraq and Obama continued? Why? In other words, why are you criticizing them when there are problems right here at home? When there are things that are wrong here? My answer has always been this: just because one thing is wrong in one place of the world doesn't mean nothing can be wrong in another part of the world. There can be more than one thing wrong with the world at a time. You know what I mean? Like, and frankly, just because America invaded Iraq and just because there, yeah, we do have problems right here at home, doesn't mean that it's okay for the Chinese Communist Party to be persecuting hundreds of millions of people, to have slave labor camps, and to have re-education through labor and live organ harvesting. That in no way justifies that. I think it's interesting that most of the people making those arguments tend to be Chinese nationals, and ones typically who align very closely with the CCP. I think it's more like a CCP talking point they've tried spreading, and unfortunately have people picking it up. I'll give another example. One big thing I've heard was, I'm very pro freedom in Taiwan. I hope Taiwan never falls under Chinese communism. But I know I've debated with Chinese agents before, and I know they were agents who said, "Well, what about Hawaii? Didn't America unjustly take Hawaii? Why should they not liberate Hawaii as part native Hawaiian?" I'm like, well, there's a little more to it than that. But again, I would say it's different. You're talking about something that happened many while back, which I actually morally disagree with. I don't think the U.S. is right in how they did that. it doesn't justify the invasion of a country and the killing of a culture and the instituting of totalitarian communism. It's the logic that you can justify evil by pointing to historical evil is crazy. If we're going to have debates like that, I'd say there's going to be no moral standard. There's going to be no standard because every culture in the world has at some point done something wrong. If having done something wrong at some point in your life makes you unable to talk about morality, what are we going to do? Like, where are we heading as a world? Can we not criticize slave labor in China? Can we not criticize the live organ harvesting of people who are just trying to be good people and their crime is literally just believing in religion? Is that where we are in a society? I think these kinds of arguments, they're important to address.
So it really is often money versus this
Yeah,
moral debate, don't you think? That people are saying, well, we've got these financial ties over here and they're willing to turn a blind eye. How do you see, your new documentary is called The Final War, but it's not just about the final war on the Chinese people who have been so devastated for decades now by the CCP, but you're also talking about the final war in relation to China against America, right here. And it seems to be, I mean, I saw the whole documentary. It was excellent, and it's very, very thorough, which is excellent and very essential for right now. We need to be getting to these details. So I highly recommend this documentary for everybody. But really, this is happening on our soil right here. It's beyond just what's happened to the Chinese people. And I keep saying to people, you got to look at what's going on in China to understand what's happening here. And you've really hit that home hard with this documentary. Can you talk about why you made the documentary and why, what is it that Americans are missing? Because it's more than just this moral versus money debate, right?
that's right. Well, in case you bring up a few really important points with this. Just starting from the top, you asked about kind of, I think, big business, funny enough, and the relationships with the Chinese Communist Party. This is one of the ironies in the political debate that in America we get stuck between right and left, and typically the right historically is pro business and do businesses do whatever they want, and the left is evil businesses and the evil millionaires and billionaires and so on. The businesses these days, because of I think technocracy, because of syndicalism, because of I think companies like BlackRock and environmental social governance investment and so on, they don't represent the free market anymore. In other words, they don't represent true capitalism, nor do the corporate reforms I think represent the free market. I think we're dealing with essentially like a perverted economic world system that is disconnected from what the free markets were originally imagined as. It is all kind of a weird merging between politics and business, even to the extent today that investment firms don't have to invest based on profit; they're investing based on politics. We essentially have a weird type of like technocratic fascism to some extent, where you have a merging between the corporate structures and the political structures. And they're using this merging of politics and business to violate our rights in ways that the government cannot legally violate them because of the Constitution. Bringing us to the topic of China. The same companies that are here lecturing us, like Nike and so on, lecturing us about the history of America, speaking of historical wrongdoings and slavery, they're lecturing us about this, and they're using slave labor in China, and they're not criticizing it. You have the NBA that is going after its own players who are while at the same time you have people kneeling on the court protesting America and the evil Americans for the history of slavery. You have a guy who writes "No slavery" on his shoes, talking about Chinese forced labor, and he gets like reprimanded. Why is it they can criticize historical slavery and demonize a country that really upholds the torch of freedom for like the modern world, but talking about actual slavery from the very companies still engaging in it, trying to falsely criticize us of ancient abuse while they're engaging in it as we speak, that you criticize that and suddenly you're like canceled or you're losing business deals and so on. In other words, the corporate structures have done terrible things. The modern corporate structures are doing terrible things with China, and to an extent, really playing a direct role in genocide and slave labor. in persecution, in democide, in cultural genocide, destroying cultures, not just in Xinjiang or East Turkestan, but also in like Tibet and Inner Mongolia. It is insane what's happening right now. Now, the documentary, addressing that part, then moving to the other parts, talks not just about the abuse of the Chinese people at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. The abuses of the Chinese Communist Party demonstrate its nature. The Chinese people, to some extent, are the canaries in the coal mine. They're showing us where we are heading if we adopt similar policies or if we fold the Chinese Communist Party as it tries to expand its system. The CCP's product of export is not, the factories and cheap goods. The product of export is the China model. And it's using engagement with business, engagement with investors, the United Nations and international systems as ways to try to export its model of governance to every part of the world, while at the same time criticizing anybody who tries to call it into question. If we do not do something about it, the things we just mentioned, all those abuses will become realities in most of the world, including possibly right here in the United States. And the documentary notes the CCP how, going back to Mao Zedong all the way up to Xi Jinping right now as we speak, have regarded the United States as its number one enemy and have step by step, constantly as a maintained policy, maintained the idea of destroying the United States, not just ideologically, not just culturally, but militarily, eventually. And, we're sleeping with the enemy, so to speak. Businesses are sleeping with the enemy. Government officials are sleeping with the enemy, and they're preaching to us this whole falsehood of moral superiority while they're doing it.
Friends, you are listening to an interview with Joshua Philipp from the Epoch Times, and we are talking about his new documentary, The Final War. Stay tuned. We have lots more to talk about. This is the Today with Kay show, and I'm Kay Rubacek. Josh, we have so much to talk about with China. And so we're looking at this morally. We're looking at this in terms of slavery. We're looking at this in terms of big corporations and the China model. At some point, I want to talk to you about what's going on in China right now with the protests and things, but looking at the China model, as you said, there's been leaders in supposedly the free world who are saying we should be looking to the China model, whether it's for COVID lockdowns or whether it's for the World Economic Forum or other things. How do you see this playing out if there's these groups of people that seem to want to support the China model, but others don't seem to even understand what the China model is? Where do you sit on this?
Okay, I think you hit an important point, which is, 2 points. One is that, a lot of international organizations are promoting the China model. Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum recently came out and said that China is a role model to many countries in the world. To his credit, which I think was written off by many people who did criticize him, he did say that he believes countries should be able to choose their own form of government. But he was praising the CCP to some extent. He was doing that during an interview with Chinese state-run media. I don't think people like him fully understand what the China model is. And part of that is because I think of the complicity of the modern press, the role of the Chinese Communist Party within the United Nations, which, again, the World Economic Forum has partnered with the United Nations on Agenda 2030, which does contain many of these elements. And many international bodies like the World Health Organization, like even the United Nations Human Rights Council, are really headed by people who are deeply supportive of the Chinese Communist Party or branches of it that are really directly controlled by the CCP. Remember, even though the United Nations members of it, who are the heads of it, are required to no longer recognize their own nations, they're supposed to have pretty much the recognition of the United Nations as the country they represent, so to speak. The Chinese Communist Party previously punished heads of United Nations branches like Interpol, International Police, for not supporting the agendas of the Chinese Communist Party while serving in the United Nations. Meaning, if you're a CCP official and you go and work at the United Nations, you have to represent the CCP. You have to push the CCP's agendas. You have to serve the CCP's interests, or they will imprison you. You will go to prison if you don't. And going now to what that means for organizations internationally try to work with the United Nations, they toe the line sometimes. I think not because they necessarily agree with these things, but because they see it as necessary for engagement. The CCP, even with diplomacy, has done this to some extent. They have their no-go topics. If you sit down with a Chinese diplomat and you're any country in the world and you bring up Taiwan or Hong Kong democracy, Falun Gong, persecution of Muslim Uyghurs, persecution of Falun Gong, or persecution of Tibetans, they're going to get up and they're going to walk out of the room. They make it clear that there's some things you cannot talk about. If you talk about them, negotiations over, get in the back of the line. Maybe in 10 years we'll talk again. And that's basically how they get countries to turn a blind eye to the negative things of that. I think that has created a real negative culture within these international institutions and within groups that do want to engage with China, where they don't acknowledge the problems that exist under the CCP. And because so many of them, whether it's academics, whether it's business people, whether it's government officials, because they don't want to anger the CCP, because they do want to engage with them, they, one, praise the CCP a little bit, and two, they don't acknowledge the topics that should really be discussed, the things that really need to be discussed. That creates a kind of cultural cloud, essentially, where people actually, I think, to an extent, start believing that the CCP does not have these problems because nobody will talk about them. And they feel that maybe if they recognize them, other people won't talk about them either, maybe even behind closed doors to some extent. They have to say, yeah, I disagree with it, but we should have engagement. That's essentially the narrative. This has led to a type of self-censorship that has completely warped the nature of international engagement with the Chinese Communist Party, and even, I think, the important discussion of what the Chinese Communist Party is. It is the greatest abuser in history of its own people. It is a genocidal, maniac regime that, as we speak, uses human beings like cattle for live organ transplants, that uses people in ways that would make even medieval slavery look relatively pleasant. If you look at for the forced labor camps and the abuses, even not of all the groups you talked about, but just for example, the Muslim Uyghurs, that really brings to a point the worst abuses in history of even like the Inquisition and the persecution against mystic beliefs to the extent of which they use torture mechanisms against what are traditional beliefs. Every religion just about persecuted in China right now. And people turn, stretching racks and abuses and tortures that I almost don't even want to repeat because they're so brutal and sickening. The raping of women with electric batons is one terrible example of this. And these governments preaching to us about social justice and so on, they won't criticize that. They won't talk about that. And again, bring us to the point. I understand why they don't. They're trying to engage with the CCP, and they think engagement is their only window to change things. But I think the complicit nature of that, where everybody bows down and nobody stands up, is allowing the CCP to dominate and push its model. And we're at a point now where if they continue to be complicit and not criticize those things, then those things that do represent the China model, this idea that governments can do whatever they want to their citizens and should not be criticized for it. This idea that there are no God-given rights, that rights are given to you solely by the government, and they can be stripped from you by the government at will for anything they say. That is the CCP model. That is what they call the China model. And that is the model that is going to be adopted in every part of the world unless these people who claim to stand up for social justice, who claim to believe in human rights, begin actually doing it and begin calling out the CCP for what it is.
What kind of diplomacy is that? Seriously, when you think about it, it seems like we're saying we're trying to have engagement, but that form of diplomacy where there's compromise, there's self-censorship, there's just saying things just for political clout. What type of diplomacy are we at? What is that even called? I don't know if there's a name for it, but where have we come in terms of international relations where that is our form of diplomacy?
That's another important too. Okay, it's not real diplomacy. It's a very self-centered diplomacy. It's people trying to make deals and trying to get things done, and they understand that they have a goal in mind. They want to sign this business deal. They want to sign this political deal. They want to make sure that the signature is on paper, and they'll be remembered in history, and they'll get the paycheck at the end of the week, and nothing else matters because they get what they wanted for it. But it's also a type of sacrifice of values. It's a type of, I think, really a crime against humanity, just being frank. And I do believe that it's going to be maybe one day if the CCP, and I do believe they will be, is held accountable for these types of crimes. You're going to have these businessmen and you're going to have these investors and these politicians who signed the papers, who were just following orders, like the Nazis famously said in the concentration camps, who were just following orders, just doing what they had to do, and they're going to have to answer for it. Why were you, saying that you opposed slavery when you were signing business deals in China using slave labor? Why were you, while preaching to the world about social justice and human rights, signing deals with the Chinese Communist Party while avoiding, for example, the topic of live organ harvesting? Why were you claiming to represent your country when you were sacrificing the interests of your country and selling your country out, selling out the future of your children for things like these infrastructure deals under the One Belt, One Road Initiative or the Belt and Road Initiative? They're going to have to answer for that. And I think what's going to come out is that they were not acting in the interest of, I think, the future. They were not acting in the interest of their own people. They were not acting in the interest of the values that they claim to represent. They were instead acting out of personal interest at the deep, deep, and terribly abusive sacrifice of innocent people.
I think for people who are just starting to really pay attention to China, especially after the pandemic, they're starting to see those things. But for those of us who, like yourself, and kudos to you and the Epoch Times for continuing to expose what's going on in China and with communism, especially around the world, it's people are only now starting to catch up, I think, to all the information that you guys have been putting out there for so long. And in your documentary, you talk about the 100-year plan, whereas the diplomacy that we were just talking about to me sounds very short term, very short term thinking, whereas the communist strategies are really looking at very long term planning, which is something that I talk a lot about in my recent book. Is just that they want us to be thinking short term, and they benefit from us thinking short term because then we forget our history. And what I like about what you presented in your documentary was the long term thinking that they have, and that they've been working on this for a very long time, even much longer than Epoch Times has been exposing communism. So, can you tell, for people who are just starting to wake up to what this threat really is for America and the American way of life and the American people, what is the 100-year plan that the CCP is sort of carrying out against us?
Yeah, well, on on people who are just starting with this topic, I want to emphasize: don't feel self-conscious for not knowing this. What we're living in, I think, is the outcome of a complicit history where the individuals, because they would not criticize these things or talk about these things, have created really an ignorant system. And I mean that in a nice way because it's not really our fault, so to speak, or not a lot of people's fault. That because there was a policy of silence, these things were not being discussed. News articles are not reporting it. Government officials are not talking about it. And the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, was the only group with the microphone, so to speak, on what China is, what has happened in China, the history of China, and what is really taking place on the ground there. And they tell people who try, like me, who try to come out and talk about it, who are you? You're not Chinese. You're not from here. Who are you to criticize us? And so it's become difficult for people to step out. It's become difficult for people to go against, I think, the wall of narrative that is formed, because it means that you have to come in very strong and show how the emperor has no clothes, so to speak. You have to be the person who stands out in the crowd and says, "Hey, you're all lying to yourselves. This is what it is. Wake up." And I do think we're at a point now where people are waking up. I do think even government officials, even in countries I never thought would, are waking up and they're beginning to criticize it. To your point, Kay, the Chinese Communist Party thinks in the long game. They have a 100-year plan specifically to defeat the United States, to destroy the United States. And this is what the documentary I did really deep dives into, and it shows how over the years, Mao Zedong, Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping, all of them played this game. All of them played into the strategy, and all of them deceived the West to some extent in one way or another to push this strategy. That there is a type of continuity, that everything we've witnessed does seem to be is connected in some way. This 100-year plan is that thread that goes through history that can really show you what they've been doing. I think we say the quiet part out loud in this documentary. That's kind of the idea. We say the thing that nobody wants to acknowledge, and we show the history of it. We show the documents of it. We show the public statements of it. We show the fruits of the tree and what it is now bearing, and demonstrate through these examples what the CCP is and what they've been saying behind the scenes and what they're doing to us right now, and frankly, what they will do to us, which is terrible if we don't change that. This documentary is just as much a history lesson as it is, I think, a real serious warning of the direction in which the free world is heading. If we don't turn that wheel a bit, if we don't steer us in a different direction and begin to push back properly against this tyrannical, evil regime.
Friends, to watch the documentary, you can go to Epoch TV and look for The Final War. And as Joshua was saying, it's not just a history lesson, it is also eye-opening, but it's also a call to action. Can you leave us with something positive? Because it can be really overwhelming. This topic can be very overwhelming. And we are seeing some really astounding changes in China with protests, people coming out on the streets. And I really believe that the actions that we take here in the West do get through. I do know they do get through to people in China, and vice versa. We are in a global world, and I think we can encourage each other that way as well. And so, what hope can you give? I would like you to touch a bit on the protests, just what your understanding of what's going on over there. But I'd like you to land on some hope, because this can be an overwhelming topic.
Okay, that's an important point. I want to emphasize the Chinese Communist Party, while the danger is serious, they're a paper tiger. Internally, they're very weak. Externally, they have a lot of strength with foreign investment and government influence and so on. Internally, they're very weak. Internally, right now, I think they're really nearing collapse. In some ways, that makes them a bit more dangerous. It's much like a wounded dog cornered. You get close, it's going to bite you, and it might lash out and it might attack. It should be regarded as that. It's in a weakened state. Right now, as we speak, Chinese people are in droves coming out in all the major cities, protesting not just against lockdowns, not just against COVID policies, but against the Chinese Communist Party itself. The Chinese people are doing that while knowing what the CCP has done previously to people just like them. They know about the Tiananmen Square massacre. They know about Mao Zedong's purges. They know Xi Jinping is really supporting many of those purges and believes very favorably of the things Mao did. They understand what it means, in other words, to go out and protest. When the Tiananmen Square massacre happened and tanks were rolling down the street heading towards Tiananmen to massacre unarmed students, there was a man who went out on the streets. The tank man is all we know of him. And he stood in front of that line of tanks. They could have rolled over him. They could have shot him. History to this day doesn't know what happened to him because people grabbed him and dragged him off. But that moment that one person at least delayed, really one of the tragedies of history, at least delayed it so that people could see it for what it was, and that famous image of bravery in front of that. Understand that every single person going on the streets right now and protesting is facing that fate. Every single one of them is that tank man, going in front of this tyrannical system, knowing what they're standing against, and knowing what it means for them to go publicly and put their necks on the chopping block. What this tells me is that the inner desire for freedom, the will for the Chinese people to be free, that human dignity is more powerful than threats of death and violence. That for them, the want for freedom, the want for what we have and take for granted, is so strong that they're willing to take that risk on themselves. I think that's something that should inspire every single person. I'll also emphasize the Chinese Communist Party, its censorship, it's saying don't talk about these human rights abuses, don't talk about these 5 no-go topics. That is not a sign of strength. That's a sign of weakness, because they know that if the world sees it for what it is, that is the end of the Communist Party. They know that if they're criticized for their crimes, if people say, look at the blood on your hands, look at what you've done to your own people, how dare you try to represent them, how dare you claim you're one and the same, you're a murderer, claiming the children of your victims and saying, look at how I saved them, look at how I raised them. And when the world realizes the crimes they've committed, they will be held accountable. And the Chinese people right now want to hold them accountable. If you want to see freedom, I'd say support the Chinese people as they're standing up against it. Recognize why they're standing up against it. Learn about what the CCP is doing, because I think truth and the light of truth is what they fear more than anything.
Words of wisdom there from Joshua Philipp of the Epoch Times. Thank you so much for joining me today. And friends, make sure you check out his documentary, The Final War. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, well, turn it into some inspiration. Look at what the Chinese people are doing. If they can overcome the greatest human rights abuser of the of our world, and they can stand up against that form of tyranny in public and overcome all of the fear and show that bravery that they're doing, you can do it too. So there's nothing that cannot be overcome. That we'll just have to let history play out, and we'll see what happens. Thank you for watching the show with me today and joining me and my guests. And do the like, subscribe, share, all of those things you need to do. If you're listening on a podcast, click the 5-star button. They don't like anything other than a 5-star. So I really would appreciate that, but better to give me nothing than if you don't want to give me 5, and I will never, ever be offended. Thank you for joining me today. You are watching the Today with Kay show. I'm Kay Rubacek, and I'll see you again soon.